Good morning, everyone. This morning I'm going to continue talking about subjects of Tozan's 5 ranks on the relative and absolute. And the last time I talked was about the absolute, and today I'm going to talk about the relative. But you'll see in a particular way I'll be talking about it. But there was a well-known historical Zen teacher named Seigen Ishin, who had this saying: before I had studied Zen for 30 years, I saw mountains as mountains and rivers as rivers. When I arrived at a more intimate knowledge, I came to the point where I saw that mountains are not mountains and rivers are not rivers. But now that I have got its very substance, I am at rest. For it's just that I see mountains once again as mountains and rivers once again as rivers. This is a well-known verse, and maybe some of you have read it or seen it. But, the question is, what's the difference between the first sentence and the last sentence? I mean, mountains are mountains, rivers are rivers. But you know that when he said mountains are not mountains and rivers are not rivers, it's touching on the absolute, which I talked about 2 weeks ago. That state is just thusness, where nothing has any particular label, where everything is just as it is. But that state, of the absolute, where the self drops away and other drops away, which means all phenomena. So mountains dropped away, rivers dropped away. At that moment, mountains were not mountains, rivers were not rivers. But then as he continued to practice and he integrated his experience in it and manifested it, he saw mountains were mountains and rivers were rivers. So are they the same or different? So Seigen Ishin obviously felt that he went through a transition with more intimate knowledge, and having gotten its very substance, he sees with clearer eyes. As you know, if you take a steel sword, and this is alluded to a lot in Zen literature, and pass it through a flame and pound it, you pound out impurities, So the sword that's been passed through the flame and pounded many times is not the same as a sword that hasn't been tempered. And Seigen Ishin, he's gone through a very profound experience. And there was a Chinese poet in the Sung dynasty named Su Shi who wrote the following verse: "The voice of the river valley are the Buddha's wide and long tongue. The form of the mountains is nothing other than his pure body." So he obviously heard the teachings of the Buddha in the sound of the mountain stream and saw the presence of the Buddha in the shape of the mountains. And this came after years of practice. So there is something holy, something divine, hidden in the most ordinary situations, and it's up to each one of us to discover it. Let's consider the example of water that's been boiled. Is it different from the unboiled water? Oh, certainly it is if there are pathogens in the original water. Now it's sterilized. Does it taste the same? The chlorine's been removed, so So are some other minerals or chemicals that will affect the taste. But ultimately, water's water. Those of you who are chemists, it's H2O. But Sagan saw mountains before he was awakened. And then he saw mountains after he was awakened. So are they the same or different? Or is it his sight that's different? I've said on a number of occasions that in our practice, it's not the circumstances of our life that change, it's our attitude towards it that change. I heard this funny story about an immigrant who didn't speak or read English very well, and her son was going to college, and he sent her a letter asking for money. And she asked a neighbor to read it, and the neighbor was in a bad mood at the time, and she said, "Well, Mom, I'm having a difficult time, and I want to know, I need some money. Will you please send me some money?" And the mother said, "Well, if with that kind of attitude, I'm not going to send him any money." And then she thought about it, and the next day, when the neighbor had a much better day, she asked her to read it again. She says, "Dear Mom, I'm having a rough time, and I wish you would please send me some money." And she says, "That's better. I'll send him the money." Yeah, so things are not what they seem, nor are they otherwise. That's what it says in the Lankavatara Sutra. There's a story about this woman in 13th century Japan, and she was a servant in a Zen convent and who wanted to practice Zazen. And one day she approached an elderly nun and said, "I'm of humble birth. I can't read or write, and I must work all the time. Is there any possibility that I could attain the way of Buddha, even though I have no skills?" And the nun answered her, "This is wonderful, my dear. In Buddhism, there's no distinctions between people. There's only this: each person must hold fast to the desire to awaken and cultivate a heart of great compassion. People are complete as they are. If you don't fall into delusive thoughts, there's no Buddha and no sentient being. There's only one complete nature. If you want to know your true nature, you need to turn toward the source of your delusive thoughts. This is called Zazen." Chiyono said with happiness, "With this practice as my companion, I have only to go about my daily practice, practicing day and night." After months of wholehearted practice, she went out on a full moon night to draw some water from the well. The bottom of her old bucket, held together by a bamboo strip, suddenly gave way, and the reflection of the moon vanished in the water with the water. When she saw this, she attained awakening. And she wrote this poem. "With this and that, I tried to keep the bucket together. And then the bottom fell out. Where the water does not collect, the moon does not dwell." One of my Dharma relatives, Merle Kodo Boyd Roshi, wrote a reflection on this story and on this verse. And Kodo, just about a week and a half ago or 2 weeks, she passed away. And when Roshi Shinko received empowerment from Roshi Gyoku with Inca as a Roshi. Kodo and Shinko did it together, so we're quite close with her. And I want to read a few of her words. And I should say that she's also the first Black American Zen Roshi in our lineage. She grew up in Texas, and then she had her practice center in New Jersey. So Kodo said, when I first heard Chiyono's verse, I had been practicing for 10 or 12 years. I was keenly aware of the constant tension keeping the bucket together. I understood the intent of practice was to relax my grip on the old bucket, but conditioning runs deep and the sense of personal identity is strong. Hearing the words with this and that, I felt the exhaustion of years of vigilance, all aimed at protecting my idea of myself. I felt the exhaustion of being my own obstacle. Our Zen practice is medicine to this conditioning. All the practices within Zen challenge the illusion of the perfect bucket, Zazen, the student-teacher relationship, ritual, Sangha relationships. As much as I may wish to appear competent at all times, I cannot immerse myself in Zen practice without a willingness to come apart. Sometimes it's appropriate to stop patching things back together. What then allows us to leave the bits and pieces scattered on the ground like splinters of the bucket around Chiyono's feet? As Zen students, we live between Chiyono's first two lines and her second two lines, between keeping things from falling apart and letting them fall apart. Knowing how to keep things together is a valuable skill. It was knowing how to care for things that led Chiyono to continually patch the bucket. When it fell apart, she makes excellent use of that circumstance as well. Our liberation deepens with the refinement of our capacity for flexibility and discernment. Just as this story of Chiyono, there are many Zen koans that point to the ordinary within the holy. Here are a few examples. In the Book of Equanimity, case 78, the monk asked Master Uman, "What is speech that transcends Buddha and goes beyond ancestors?" And Uman said, "Farm rice cake." Farm rice cake. There's something about farm rice cake that I didn't know when I first did this koan, but it's crude food. It's made, by people who work the land. It's not a fancy cake like you're going to get in a high scale Japanese restaurant or Chinese restaurant. It's plain, like plain water, like the taste of plain water. So what transcends Buddha and goes beyond the ancestors? Just farm rice cake. Nothing special, just our life. And then a monk asked Uman, "What is Buddha?" And he said, "A shit stick." You don't know that koan. So maybe you need a little history. A shit stick, that's what they used as what we used as toilet paper. They use it to wipe their bottoms. Right there, in an ordinary thing. Something you would least expect. Buddha. Soiled toilet paper. Is that Buddha? Maizumi Roshi told me about a monk in the monastery that had an awakening experience while he was going to the bathroom, sitting on the commode. Right there. That's Buddha. And Joshu asked Nansen, "What is the way?" And Nansen said, "Ordinary mind is the way." That's in the Mumonkan, case 19. Ordinary mind is the way. It's extraordinary in its ordinariness. So what makes ordinary life extraordinary? So if we live our life to the fullness, instead of just going through the paces as we wait for our life to end, what is the best vehicle to live our life to the fullest? It's kind of funny when we say that ordinary life is extraordinary. Kind of puffs it up. But then if we hold on to anything, we're stuck. I heard that once Kapilo Roshi said to a student, "Don't be so humble, you aren't that great." Don't be humble. Don't be so humble. So we can hold on to anything. So what's extraordinary? We have a phrase, nothing compares to a hazy moon on a spring night. The hazy moon, when you look up and there's clouds and there's a moon, and sometimes this moon appears and sometimes it disappears. That's how the ordinary life becomes extraordinary, when that moon suddenly appears and then it gets covered up again. So, what is it? Is there a moon there? Or is there not a moon there? Are we awakened or are we not awakened? And then there's a famous verse of Layman Pong. He said, "My daily activities are not unusual. I'm just naturally in harmony with them, grasping nothing, discarding nothing. In every place, there's no hindrance, no conflict. Who assigns the rank of vermilion and purple?" The rank vermilion and purple, that's like the emperor. "The hills and mountains, last speck of dust is extinguished. My supernatural power and marvelous activity is drawing water and carrying firewood." It's a famous verse of Layman Pong, drawing wood and carrying firewood, drawing water and carrying firewood. I think there actually was a book by that name about Zen years ago. So everything we do is marvelous activity. It just depends on how we see it, with which eyes we see it. It can be drudgery or it can be a joy. How do we take it? Yeah. And in the book of equanimity, there's a a verse that says, washing bowls and filling the wash basin are both Dharma gates and Buddha's affairs. Washing bowls and filling the wash basin are both Dharma gates and Buddha affairs. So every time you fill the sink with water to wash dishes, that's a Dharma gate. And we chant in the 4 Bodhisattva vows, omnipresent Dharma gates I vow to experience. Yeah. Washing the dishes, filling the sink, sweeping the floor. Marvelous Buddha activity. To quote Thich Nhat Hanh, every minute can be holy, a sacred minute. Where do you seek the spiritual? You seek the spiritual in every ordinary thing that you do every day. Sweeping the floor, watering the vegetables, and washing the dishes become holy and sacred if mindfulness is there. With mindfulness and concentration, everything becomes spiritual. So, where do we not see it? It's hard to maintain that attitude, when there's deadly, brutal war going on the planet. And I saw some video clips of some of the people who are cowering in safe places and tunnels and trying to protect their families from the bombardment that's going on. And even in those situations, in the videos, there were children and they would smile at just the smallest thing given to them. Seeing, the beauty in just that moment, even though it's terrifying. So in our Zen practice, one doesn't confuse spirituality with thinking about God or about the infinite while one is peeling potatoes. Zen spirituality is just to peel the potatoes. Can we find it there? That's the question. Thank you.